Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and welcome to our third lecture. We discussed a little bit the planning of our research and literature reviews and different research paradigms accessible to us. And today we are approaching the more practical side of research design, basically different sources of data and different ways to collect data using samples. So today we'll make a brief overview of data sources and data collection methods that are available to us as psychologists, and our main attention will be devoted to probably one of the most painful issues that we face when we plan and develop our own research studies, the issue of samples. How can we make sure that we get a good sample of responses? Um, what kind of sampling strategy can we use? Which strategies are better and which ones are worse? But before we approach that, we'll take a little bit of look at statistics, and we'll start introducing some statistical concepts today, so don't be afraid. Bear with me, I hope it will not be very complicated. And to conclude, we'll discuss the issues of online research. What kind of possibilities there exist to collect data online, and how can we make best use of these possibilities? So before we begin, what kind of data sources and what kind of data collection methods are available to us as psychologists? And here we will come back to our first lecture when I showed you this diagram, which shows 6 different sources of data that we can use. Obviously, most commonly we use self-reports and rely on conscious subjective experience. We use some kind of self-report questionnaires, or we conduct interviews with our participants. And this way we can get a snapshot of how the person sees what's happening to them. But of course, it was already behaviorists who said that this conscious representation is not always quite precise. And we know that there are a lot of different biases when people see the reality not the way it is. This is why it is best to complement the self-report data with some more valid data. For example, with behavioral data, in addition to asking a person to describe their own personality, we could also ask their friends to rate their personality characteristics, and that would be a peer report. Or we could collect some biographical data, and this way we can get some more objective view of what's happening to a person in their life, what kind of changes, what kind of choices they made during their life course. And for some constructs, we have objective tests. For example, for IQ, we can measure it using an objective IQ test rather than relying just on self-report. And for some social attitudes and some deeper personality processes, we can use implicit measures. Implicit measures that address the unconscious level of processing of information. And we often use measures such as implicit association tests to detect biases or to detect attitudes that people actually would not like to admit, but they have them. And of course, sometimes we can use physiological measures, and sometimes we can use archival data coming from large-scale surveys conducted internationally. And this is especially important for applied social psychologists, because you're interested often in research questions that concern social and cultural level phenomena. And that's why using archival data is actually a very good way to develop a research study without collecting your own data, which would be like inventing the bicycle. What is a data collection method? Basically, no matter what data source we rely on, the data in real world are represented in qualitative form. Imagine that you're coming to a nice, beautiful meadow where there are many beautiful flowers and you're smelling them. And this is basically qualitative data. So at this stage, we have a choice. You can stick to qualitative paradigm, and as if in this meadow, you will record your impressions, you will record what you see and what you feel, and your associations, or maybe you will ask other people to record their impressions as well. And this way, you will get what we call a thick description or some interview data and you can analyze it with some qualitative research method that we'll be talking about closer to the end of our course. But unfortunately, this approach, even though it provides a rich description, it is difficult to generalize qualitative findings. This is why most often we try to use quantitative approach. We try to quantify the data that we have, and if we are seeing, for example, a meadow, we need to decide what it is that we want to quantify. Do we want to count the numbers of flowers of different types per square meter? Or do we want to measure the length of leaves? Or do we want to measure the number of petals on each flower? So depending on our research question, we choose different aspects of reality that we are trying to measure. And these are our variables. What is a variable? A variable is a value that takes different values for different observations that reflects an aspect of the phenomenon that we want to measure or that we want to study. And a variable is always quantitative. If a variable cannot be quantified, this is qualitative data. So a variable takes different values for different observations. What is an observation or a case? It is a unit of our analysis. Most often it is a person. And then we can measure variables like a person's height or a person's weight or a person's IQ. So for each person we will get a different result. But sometimes a unit of our analysis might be larger or might be smaller. Sometimes we might work with cross-cultural data at the level of countries, and then one observation is a country, and all the variables that we have are measured at the level of country, like GDP or average score on individualism or collectivism from Hofstede or whatever it is. And sometimes our units might be even smaller than a person. For example, in longitudinal studies, we might measure the same person on 3 or 4 or 5 different occasions. As a result, each variable is measured for each occasion of measurement, and we are working at this lower level. Usually, in most studies, we are just working with one level of analysis. But if you want to combine several levels of analysis, like combining variables that are measured at the level of countries and at the level of individuals, then you will need a more tricky statistical models, multi-level models. So I hope that the difference between a variable and a case is clear. Maybe you have already encountered it before. What kind of variables do we use in our research? Most often we are interested in latent constructs, and latent constructs are hypothetical variables. We can't observe them, we cannot measure them directly, and we just introduce them theoretically. For example, needs. We say that a person has a need for achievement or a person has a need for food. And there are different ways we can operationalize those constructs by relating them to some kind of measurable or observed variables. For example, to measure the extent to which we have the need for food, actually you can bring a person to a canteen and propose to them to eat as many cookies as they want, and then you can count the number of cookies that the person has eaten. And this way you will operationalize this measurement of this need. But obviously there are different ways to operationalize the same latent constructs, and they are not always equally good enough. And when we work with data, we either work with observed variables, or sometimes we also try to reconstruct latent variables. Latent variables are variables that we estimate based on a bunch of observed variables. For example, you want to measure need for achievement, and you are giving a person 3 different questionnaires that measure different aspects of this need for achievement, and then you conduct some kind of factor analytic model in order to arrive at a better estimate of this need for achievement, which will be more precise than estimate from each individual questionnaire taken alone. So latent variables are kind of closer to latent constructs, and we say that they can represent latent constructs. With respect to different variable types in relation to hypotheses, those variables can be independent or they can be dependent. and we'll discuss this distinction in much detail in a couple of meetings when we will focus on experimental designs. So don't worry if this distinction is not so clear to you. And there are also confounding variables or confounds that intervene with our reality that we are trying to study. And we try to eliminate these confounding variables to the extent possible. For example, from different countries, you might get comparable samples of students, but in some countries, students might be actually a larger proportion of the population or a smaller proportion of the population. They might differ with respect to their socioeconomic status in relation to the population. So this socioeconomic status will be a confounding variable that will intervene with your measurements and that will introduce some additional differences, some additional variance or some error. That's why we try to measure these confounds to eliminate them either by means of our research design or to control them statistically with some kind of regression model. In our course, we will be discussing some data collection methods in more detail. We will focus on questionnaires and surveys. We will focus quite a bit on measurement. We will not focus very much on observation, interviews, and archival data. That's why today I will just make a brief introduction into these methods that we don't really use often, but you need to have some idea of how we're supposed to use them when you develop your own study. With observation, we don't often use observation, but if you decide to use observation, you need to be aware that there are many different types of observation. First of all, people might be aware that they are being observed, or they might not be aware that they are being observed. This explicit observation, imagine that at school a teacher is giving a lesson and there is a person who came from the Ministry of Education to observe this lesson and make records. So the teacher is very stressed and the children are sensing this and they are also very stressed. This is what happens sometimes with explicit observation. It may change people's behavior. So a tacit observation or hidden observation is when people don't know that they're being observed. For example, you put a hidden camera, but this might be an ethics issue. So we're only allowed to do it in situations where people expect to be observed by an unlimited number of people. But in a situation like a classroom, you need to ask for people's permission to record, even using a small camera in the corner. Also, the person who is observing might actually take part in the situation. For example, teacher might be given a lesson and she might put down some notes, which she will later use for some analytic procedures. Or she might be completely excluded from the process and observe it from the side. And with respect to setting, observation can happen in a real situation, or it can happen in a lab where conditions are created to make things easier. But regardless of how you do it or where you do it, the most important distinction between observation is between uncategorized and categorized observation. Historically, when people observed, they would just record whatever seemed important. For example, in ethnography, in cultural anthropology, when anthropologists like Margaret Mead or Gregory Bateson would come to a new tribe, they would observe the behavior of people in that tribe, and they would just make records in their diaries, and then they would travel back to their home countries, and they would analyze those records and write up. This is not the way we do observations nowadays. Nowadays, in psychology, the standard is categorized observation. So just like we were discussing about this meadow, that you need to decide what it is that is interesting for you in this meadow. With categorized observation, you need to decide and make a list of target behaviors, that you are interested in, and you need to create criteria of each behavior, appearing or not appearing. So some kind of coding scheme, some kind of criteria that you can rate these behaviors, whether it's present or absent, or intensity on a 5-point scale. For example, if a person is smiling, how intense this smile is. Is it a genuine Duchenne smile or is it a fake smile which only affects the mouth? And then ideally you would need to recruit different observers to make sure that this coding scheme works in the same way. So for example, here you can see an observation checklist for a study where researchers were interested in what happens when the teacher leaves the room. And there is a list of 7 or 8 target behaviors that observers would mark on their sheet. Of course, nowadays, this is all done automatically. So nowadays, the standard procedure with observation is to make a video recording of this situation that you're interested in, and then you analyze this video recording using a special software like Noldus Observer, but there are also other probably types of this software. So this software lets you upload the video, and then you define the list of target behaviors that you're interested in, and you assign those target behaviors to points in time, and you can rate also the intensity or how long each behavior took place. And also different raters can rate the same video in parallel, and then you can compare or average their results to arrive at a more reliable and more valid result and export it to some kind of statistical package for statistical processing. So this is how we do observations nowadays. And with interviews, it is also a little bit similar. There are different types of interviews. If you encounter a sociologist, a sociological poll in the street, there is always an exact set of questions that they ask to every person, and there is usually also an exact set of answers that you're supposed to give. And this is called a structured interview. In psychology, we usually use either semi-structured or unstructured interviews. In a semi-structured interview, you have an approximate set of questions, but you can also ask additional questions, or you can ask a person to clarify something or to develop on some point to get a better understanding of how they feel or what they think about your research, the thing that you're studying. And sometimes we conduct unstructured or in-depth interviews when we don't exactly know what it is that we are looking for, or we don't exactly know what kind of words people use to actually describe this. Or maybe when the topic is very personal, is very difficult to talk about, and it requires establishing some contact. In this case, you just make an approximate set of questions or an approximate set of themes you're interested in, but then with each person you talk for a long time and you ask different questions depending on what they answer and depending on how they call this reality that you're interested in. And regardless of what kind of type of interview you use, we usually use qualitative methods for data analysis because it's a bit hard to quantify the variables we are working with. And the right way when doing interviews is always to record the interview with some audio recording equipment. You can do it online and make a recording on Zoom, or you can do it in person and just use some kind of phone. Of course, you need to have participants' permission to have their interview recorded, and you need to explain to them how long it will be stored and who will have access and when it will be erased. And then based on this recording, you make a full transcript of the text, and you work with this full transcript. You code fragments in the text, you assign different themes, and you can also use special software for that, like NVivo, or some other MaxQDA, some other type of software. There are many different pieces of software, but here basically maybe you don't even need software very much because it's easy to do as well by hand. So the most important part is that you record everything just to make sure that you don't miss anything, and then you develop a coding procedure, which also takes some time, and we will discuss about it later on in our qualitative methods theme. The other data collection type is a survey using questionnaires. There are very many different types of questionnaires and many different types of questions, and we will discuss all those tricky things in our next meeting. How can we actually choose between the type of questions that we want? How can we decide how many answer options do we want? And how can we make sure that our questions are actually measuring what they are supposed to measure. So what kind of psychometric procedures do we need in order to validate our scale? All of these things we will discuss very soon. And obviously we are tempted to conduct a survey every time. But sometimes perhaps someone has already done it, and maybe someone has had a lot of funding. Maybe they spent $1 million to conduct a large-scale survey in a representative sample in many countries. So in case if there is already some data available that allows you to test your hypothesis, and obviously if no one has tested this hypothesis using this data before, then you can basically use this existing data. And there are many great international studies like World Values Survey or European Social Survey and many others, European Values Survey, where the data are available publicly online, and every person, every researcher is allowed to use this data and to publish their own analysis, their own results. Obviously, not every piece of data that you find online is free for use, because sometimes researchers are just required by journals to post their raw data. But that does not mean that they are happy with someone actually using this data for analysis and publishing their findings. So if the data you're working with belongs to some specific person, and if it's not clear whether you're allowed to use this data for your own analysis, it's better to ask that person. Obviously, for master's dissertation, no one's going to know that you used their data, but if you want to publish the results later on, it might not be possible unless you have a permission from the author. And in large-scale surveys, in research data archives, usually there are some kind of terms of use that describe what you can or what you cannot do with this data. So if someone has already collected some data that allows you to test your own hypothesis, why not use it?